The rain hammered against the factory windows like bullets, each drop exploding into 1,000 fragments before sliding down the glass in defeated streaks. Daniel Brooks stood at his workstation, methodically reviewing the production reports that had piled up during his week away, his weathered hands moving with the practiced efficiency of 15 years on this floor. The familiar hum of machinery filled the air, punctuated by the occasional shout from Carlos across the production line and the rhythmic clang of metal on metal that had become the soundtrack of his adult life. At 42, Daniel had the kind of face that inspired trust without demanding attention. His brown hair was beginning to show silver at the temples, and deep lines around his eyes spoke of countless early mornings and late nights spent ensuring operations ran smoothly. He wore his responsibility like a comfortable old coat, never flashy but always reliable. The workers respected him not because he demanded it, but because he'd earned it one honest interaction at a time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His phone buzzed against his hip, displaying a text from Ethan. "Feeling better today, Dad. Thanks for staying with me last week, love you." Daniel's chest tightened with a familiar mixture of pride and worry that seemed to define single parenthood. 7 days in the hospital watching his 10-year-old son fight pneumonia had aged him more than the previous year combined. But Ethan was recovering, and that was all that mattered. "Brooks." The voice cut through the factory noise like a blade. Daniel looked up to see Gerald Kane's assistant, a nervous young woman whose hands perpetually trembled when delivering messages from the executive floor. "Mr. Kane wants to see you in his office. Now." The walk to the executive elevator felt longer than usual, his work boots echoing against polished floors that grew progressively more expensive with each level. By the time he reached Gerald's corner office, Daniel's shirt had begun to stick to his back despite the building's aggressive air conditioning. Something about the summons felt different, urgent in a way that made his stomach clench. Gerald Kane sat behind his massive mahogany desk like a king holding court, his perfectly pressed suit and Italian leather shoes a stark contrast to Daniel's practical work clothes. At 55, Gerald had the kind of aggressive handsomeness that came from expensive haircuts and personal trainers, his silver hair slicked back and his pale blue eyes cold as winter morning. He didn't look up when Daniel entered, instead continuing to study a file with theatrical concentration. Linda Carver stood in the corner, her usually warm demeanor replaced by something Daniel couldn't quite read. As HR director, Linda had always been an ally, helping him navigate the increasingly complex web of corporate policies that seemed to multiply like weeds. Today, she wouldn't meet his eyes. "Sit down, Brooks." Gerald's voice carried the kind of authority that came from never being questioned, never having to consider the human cost of his decisions. "We need to discuss your recent absence." Daniel lowered himself into the leather chair, his hands instinctively gripping the armrests. "My son was hospitalized with pneumonia. I filed all the proper paperwork for family medical leave. Linda approved it." "Yes, well." Gerald finally looked up, his expression carved from ice. "That's exactly the problem. This company operates on discipline, Brooks. Structure. When employees start taking extended leave for every minor illness, it sets a dangerous precedent." "Minor illness?" The words escaped before Daniel could stop them. "My son nearly died." Gerald waved a dismissive hand. "Children recover. They're resilient. But companies suffer when key personnel abandon their responsibilities. Your absence cost us the Morrison contract, delayed 3 shipments, created chaos on the floor." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. He'd trained his entire team to handle operations in his absence, had checked in daily from the hospital, had Carlos Mendez supervising every detail. "That's not possible." "I had everything covered. Carlos can verify." "Carlos Mendez isn't management material," Gerald interrupted, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a child. "He's a good worker, I'll grant you, but he lacks the vision, the strategic thinking required for real leadership, unlike you, who I had hoped possessed those qualities." The word "had" hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Daniel's chest tightened as the implications became clear. "Gerald, if this is about the Morrison contract, let me explain what actually happened." "What happened, Brooks, is that you chose sentiment over duty. Family over responsibility. In 15 years with this company, you've been adequate, I'll give you that. But adequate isn't enough anymore. We're in a competitive market, and I need managers who understand that success requires sacrifice. Linda shifted in the corner, her discomfort palpable. Daniel caught her eye for a moment and saw something there. Not just sympathy, but a kind of desperate urgency, as if she were trying to communicate something vital without words. This is effective immediately, Gerald continued, sliding a manila folder across the desk. 2 weeks, severance, which is more generous than required. Your final paycheck will be deposited according to normal schedule. Linda will escort you to collect your personal belongings. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Daniel stared at the folder without opening it, his mind struggling to process what was happening. 15 years of loyalty, of late nights and early mornings, of training younger workers and preventing countless problems through pure experience and dedication, gone because he'd chosen to stay with his sick child. You can't be serious. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, hollow and distant. Gerald was already looking at other papers, the dismissal complete in his mind. Security will escort you to your car. I trust this transition will remain professional. Daniel stood slowly, his legs unsteady. Through the large windows behind Gerald's desk, he could see the factory floor where he'd spent most of his adult life, where men like Carlos Mendez depended on leadership that understood their struggles, their worth beyond quarterly numbers. Those workers would learn about this within the hour, would understand that loyalty meant nothing when it conflicted with the cold mathematics of profit margins. Linda followed him to the elevator, her silence heavier than words. As the doors closed, Daniel caught one last glimpse of Gerald Kane, already on his phone, probably explaining to the board how he'd eliminated another inefficiency in the system. The rain had intensified by the time Daniel reached his car, his cardboard box of personal belongings growing soggy in the few steps from the building to the parking lot. 15 years reduced to a coffee mug, a few family photos, and a small plaque recognizing his perfect safety record. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time, listening to the rain drum against the roof, wondering how he was going to explain to Ethan that their already precarious financial situation had just become a crisis. As he finally started the engine, Daniel's phone buzzed with another text from his son. "Can't wait to see you tonight, Dad. I want to show you the robot design I've been working on." The simple message nearly broke him. Ethan's excitement, his trust that his father would always be there, would always provide stability in a world that had already taken his mother away. Daniel pulled out of the parking lot slowly, his windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the storm. He didn't look back at the building where he'd spent his career, where he'd believed that hard work and integrity still meant something. Tomorrow he would have to find the strength to rebuild. Tonight, he just needed to get home to his son. The kitchen light cast a warm glow over the worn Formica table, its surface scarred by years of homework sessions, art projects, and the countless small rituals of single parenthood. Daniel sat in his usual chair, bills spread before him like a puzzle he couldn't solve, his calculator displaying numbers that refused to add up to hope. The pink slip from Gerald Kane lay beside the stack of envelopes, its clinical language a stark reminder that 15 years of service could be reduced to 2 paragraphs of corporate speak. Ethan emerged from his bedroom, still pale from his recent illness but moving with the determined energy of a 10-year-old who refused to let pneumonia define him. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles, and he wore his favorite pajamas, the ones with tiny gears and springs printed across the fabric. Despite everything, Daniel felt his heart lift at the sight of his son. "How was work today, Dad?" Ethan settled into the chair across from him, automatically reaching for the small notebook where he sketched his mechanical designs. The question was casual, but Daniel caught the slight tension in his son's voice. Ethan had always been perceptive, able to read emotions in the set of someone's shoulders or the rhythm of their breathing. Daniel's hand stilled on the calculator. He'd rehearsed this conversation during the drive home, had practiced different ways to explain unemployment to a 10-year-old without causing panic. But looking at Ethan's trusting face, the words seemed to evaporate. It was different today. Daniel pushed the bills aside, focusing entirely on his son. "Actually, I won't be going back to that job anymore." Ethan's pencil stopped moving across the page. "Did you get fired?" The directness of the question shouldn't have surprised Daniel. Ethan had always preferred truth to comfort, clarity to false reassurance. It was a trait inherited from his mother, who had possessed the same unflinching honesty about life's complexities. Yes, Daniel said quietly. I did. Because you stayed with me in the hospital? The ache in Daniel's chest deepened. He reached across the table, covering his son's small hand with his own. Because I made the right choice, even when it cost me something important. Taking care of you will always be more important than any job. Ethan nodded slowly, processing this information with the seriousness of someone far older than his years. Mom always said that doing the right thing isn't supposed to be easy. The mention of Margaret hit Daniel like a physical blow. 3 years since cancer had taken her away, and he still felt her presence in moments like this. Still heard her voice guiding him through the impossible task of raising their son alone. She had possessed an innate understanding of leadership that had nothing to do with titles or authority, everything to do with lifting others up even when it required personal sacrifice. She did say that. Daniel's voice caught slightly. Your mom believed that real strength comes from knowing what matters most, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. Ethan returned to his sketching, but Daniel could see the wheels turning in his young mind. Are we going to be okay? Money-wise, I mean? Daniel looked at the bills spread across the table, calculating in his head how long their savings would last. The mortgage payment alone would consume most of his severance check. Ethan's medical bills from the recent hospitalization had already strained their budget to the breaking point. Without steady income, they were looking at perhaps 2 months before serious decisions would need to be made. We'll figure it out, Daniel said, and meant it. I've got some savings, and there will be other jobs. Good jobs, with companies that understand what loyalty means. The phone rang, cutting through the kitchen's quiet intimacy. Carlos Mendez. Name appeared on the caller ID, and Daniel could already imagine his friend's fury. News traveled fast on the factory floor, especially news this shocking. Danny, what the hell happened? Carlos's voice carried the weight of 15 years of friendship, of shared struggles and mutual support through layoffs, plant closures, and personal tragedies. I heard Kane called you up to his office and that was it. Security escort and everything. Daniel glanced at Ethan, who had resumed his sketching but was obviously listening. Can I call you back in a few minutes? This is bullshit, Danny. Complete bullshit. The whole floor is talking about it. Jenkins said Kane's already sent around a memo about commitment to excellence and maintaining professional standards. Like you haven't been the most committed guy in that place since day one. Carlos. No, listen to me. This isn't over. There's got to be something we can do. Some way to fight this. Maybe Linda knows something. Maybe there's a procedure we can follow. The mention of Linda Carver made Daniel pause. Something about her behavior in Gerald's office had struck him as odd. The way she'd avoided eye contact, the tension in her posture. Linda had always been straightforward with him, had helped him navigate company policies during Margaret's illness and after her death. Today, she'd seemed almost guilty. Let me think about it, Daniel said finally. I need to process all this, figure out what comes next. You don't process getting screwed over, Danny. You fight back. After Carlos hung up, Daniel sat in the quiet kitchen, watching his son work on his latest mechanical drawing. Ethan's concentration was absolute, his pencil moving with the kind of focused precision that reminded Daniel of watching Margaret paint watercolors at this same table. She'd had that same ability to lose herself in creation, to find peace in the act of making something beautiful from nothing. What are you designing? Daniel asked. A sorting machine, Ethan replied without looking up. Something that could separate different types of screws and bolts automatically, so workers wouldn't have to do it by hand. I was thinking about those big bins in your factory, how much time you guys spend just organizing parts. Daniel leaned over to examine the sketch, marveling at the sophistication of his son's thinking. The design showed a series of graduated slots and mechanical arms, with detailed notes about size specifications and operational efficiency. At 10 years old, Ethan was already thinking like an engineer, seeing problems and visualizing solutions. This is incredible work, buddy. Really sophisticated thinking. Ethan beamed, then grew thoughtful again. Dad, can I ask you something? Always. When you were at the factory all those years, did you ever want to change things? Like, make them better for the workers? The question caught Daniel off guard. He thought about the countless small improvements he'd suggested over the years, most of which had been dismissed as too expensive or unnecessary. The safety protocols that could have prevented injuries, the efficiency upgrades that would have saved both time and money. the training programs that could have developed talent from within instead of hiring expensive consultants. All the time, Daniel admitted, but sometimes, people in charge aren't interested in changing things that already make them money, even if those changes could make things better for everyone. That seems stupid. Daniel laughed despite himself. It does, doesn't it? The phone rang again, this time displaying Linda Carver's name. Daniel hesitated, then answered. Daniel, I'm sorry to call so late, but Linda's voice sounded strained, unlike her usual professional composure. Could you meet me tomorrow morning? There's something we need to discuss. Something about your uncle's will. Daniel frowned. His uncle Robert had died 2 years ago, leaving him the house Daniel and Ethan now lived in, plus a small amount of savings that had helped them through Margaret's medical bills. The estate had been settled long ago, all documents filed and processed. I'm not sure what you mean, Linda. Everything was handled by the lawyers back then. Not everything, Linda said quietly. There's something you need to remember, Daniel. Something your uncle wanted kept confidential unless circumstances required it. The urgency in her voice made Daniel's pulse quicken. What kind of circumstances? The kind that happened today. Can you meet me at Murphy's Cafe on 5th Street? Tomorrow at 9? After Linda hung up, Daniel sat staring at the phone, trying to piece together what she might be referring to. Uncle Robert had been a successful businessman, the founder of several small manufacturing companies before his retirement. He'd always been generous with Daniel's family, but their relationship had been warm rather than particularly close. Everything okay, Dad? Ethan looked up from his drawing, concern creasing his young features. I think so, Daniel said, though uncertainty gnawed at him. Just some paperwork stuff to sort out tomorrow. They finished the evening with their usual routine, checking homework, reviewing Ethan's latest mechanical designs, and sharing a bowl of ice cream while watching an old science fiction movie. But Daniel's mind kept returning to Linda's call, to the strange note of urgency in her voice when she mentioned his uncle's will. As he tucked Ethan into bed, his son grabbed his hand. Dad, whatever happens with jobs and money and stuff, we're still a team, right? Daniel squeezed his son's fingers gently. The best team in the world, buddy. Nothing's going to change that. Later, alone in the kitchen with the bills still scattered across the table, Daniel found himself thinking about Margaret's favorite saying, lead by lifting others. She'd believed that real power came not from authority or position, but from the ability to make other people stronger, better, more capable of achieving their own dreams. Tomorrow, he would meet Linda and discover what secret his uncle had kept. Tonight, he would trust that somehow, some way, he would find a path forward that honored both Margaret's memory and Ethan's faith in him. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving behind the clean scent of rain-washed air and the promise of a new day. Murphy's Cafe occupied the corner of 5th and Main like an old friend who refused to leave the neighborhood, its brick walls weathered by decades of economic ups and downs, its neon sign flickering with the same stubborn persistence as its elderly owner. Daniel arrived early, claiming a booth in the back where the morning light filtered through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned since the Clinton administration. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and the vinyl seats bore the comfortable sags of countless conversations about love, loss, and the endless struggle to make ends meet. Linda Carver appeared in the doorway at exactly 9 o'clock, her usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, as if she'd spent the night wrestling with decisions that had no clean answers. She wore a simple gray suit instead of her typical professional attire, and her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that made her look younger, more vulnerable than the confident HR director Daniel had known for years. Thank you for coming, she said, sliding into the booth across from him. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the leather portfolio she'd carried in, extracting a manila folder thick with documents. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me after yesterday. Daniel studied her face, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the tight line of her mouth. You didn't fire me, Linda. Gerald did. No, but I let it happen. I sat there like a coward and watched him destroy your life because he was too proud to admit he'd mishandled the Morrison contract himself. She paused as the waitress approached, ordering black coffee with shaking hands. I should have spoken up. Should have reminded him about your uncle's provisions. What provisions? Daniel leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Linda, I need you to start from the beginning. What does my uncle's will have to do with any of this? Linda opened the folder, revealing documents Daniel recognized from the probate process 2 years earlier. But beneath the familiar paperwork lay pages he'd never seen, bearing the letterhead of Whitman, Cobb and Associates, the prestigious law firm that had handled Uncle Robert's more complex business arrangements. Your Uncle Robert didn't just leave you his house and savings, Daniel. He left you something much more significant. Linda's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He left you controlling interest in Brooks Manufacturing. The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Daniel stared at the documents, his mind struggling to process what Linda had just said. Brooks Manufacturing, the company where he'd worked for 15 years, where Gerald Kane ruled like a corporate tyrant, where Daniel had just been fired for the crime of caring about his sick child. That's impossible, Daniel said slowly. Gerald runs the company, he owns it. Gerald owns 49%, Linda corrected, sliding the key document across the table. Your uncle retained 51% until his death, then passed it to you with very specific instructions about confidentiality. Daniel's hands shook as he examined the shareholder agreement, the legal language swimming before his eyes. There was his name, clear as day, listed as majority shareholder of Brooks Manufacturing Company, Incorporated. The document was dated 6 months after Margaret's death, around the time Uncle Robert had insisted on those long conversations about family legacy and the responsibility that came with unexpected inheritance. Why didn't I know about this? Daniel's voice sounded strange in his own ears, hollow with shock. The lawyers never mentioned. Because your uncle specifically requested that the information be withheld unless certain conditions were met. Linda pulled out another document, this one in Uncle Robert's familiar handwriting. He believed you needed time to grieve your wife, to find your footing as a single father. He didn't want the burden of ownership to complicate your recovery. Daniel read his uncle's letter, the familiar cadence of the old man's voice echoing in every carefully chosen word. Danny, if you're reading this, it means you've encountered a situation that requires you to know the full truth about your inheritance. I've watched you for 15 years, seen how you treat people, how you lead without needing a title. Real leadership isn't about power, it's about service. It's about understanding that the greatest authority comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down. I built Brooks Manufacturing to provide good jobs for good people. Under Gerald's management, it's become something I no longer recognize. If circumstances have forced Linda to share this letter, then the time has come for you to decide what kind of leader you want to be. You can use this authority for revenge, or you can use it to restore the company to its original purpose. Your wife would have known which choice to make. Trust her memory to guide you. Daniel set the letter down with trembling hands, his uncle's words hitting him like physical blows. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. Lead by lifting others. She'd believed that real power came from service, from making other people stronger and more capable. Now, suddenly, he possessed the ultimate corporate authority and had to choose how to wield it. Gerald has no idea, does he? Daniel asked. Linda shook her head. He thinks he's the majority owner. When your uncle died, I was instructed to maintain that fiction unless you specifically chose to reveal the truth. Gerald believes he inherited control when your uncle passed, but legally, he's been answering to you for 2 years. The irony was almost unbearable. Gerald Kane, the man who'd just fired Daniel for choosing family over corporate efficiency, had unknowingly been taking orders from the very person he'd dismissed as inadequate. The man who'd lectured Daniel about sacrifice and professional commitment was actually an employee himself, subject to the authority of the sentimental operations manager he'd just escorted from the building. What's the company's current situation? Daniel asked, his mind beginning to shift from shock to strategy. Financially, I mean. Linda glanced around the cafe, ensuring their conversation remained private. Not good. Gerald's cost-cutting measures have created serious morale problems. We've lost 3 major contracts this quarter due to quality issues, and 2 of our best supervisors have quit for positions at competitors. The Morrison contract you supposedly cost us? Gerald mishandled the negotiations himself, then needed someone to blame. Daniel thought about Carlos Mendez, about the frustrated workers on the factory floor who'd watched their benefits shrink while executive bonuses grew. He thought about the safety protocols Gerald had deemed unnecessary expenses and the training programs that had been cut to improve quarterly numbers. There's more, Linda continued reluctantly. Gerald's been in discussions with Hartwell Industries about a potential acquisition. If that deal goes through, he's planning massive layoffs. Half the workforce would be gone within 6 months. He can't make that decision without majority shareholder approval, Daniel said, the legal implications beginning to crystallize in his mind. He doesn't know that. In his mind, he owns 51% and you're just a fired ex-employee who can't cause him any problems. Linda leaned forward, her voice urgent. Daniel, you have the power to stop this. You have the authority to remove Gerald, to change the company's direction entirely. But you need to act quickly. Daniel stared out the cafe window at the quiet street where ordinary people went about their morning routines, unaware that their livelihoods depended on decisions made in boardrooms by men who saw them as numbers on spreadsheets. The weight of unexpected responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. If I do this, he said slowly, if I reveal what I own and challenge Gerald's authority, there's no going back. It changes everything. Everything's already changed, Linda reminded him. You were fired yesterday for being a good father. Your friends on the factory floor are facing layoffs because Gerald values profit margins over people. The question isn't whether to act. It's whether to act for revenge or for something better. Daniel thought about Ethan's mechanical drawings, about his son's instinctive understanding that systems could be improved, that problems had solutions if you were willing to think creatively and work hard. He thought about Margaret's unwavering belief that leadership meant service, that real power came from lifting others up. What would I need to do, legally, I mean? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Linda smiled for the first time since entering the cafe. Call a special meeting of the board of directors. As majority shareholder, you have that right. Present your concerns about current management and call for a leadership review. The board would have no choice but to listen. And Gerald? Gerald would discover that the man he fired yesterday morning is actually his boss. The man he dismissed as adequate holds his professional future in his hands. Daniel gathered the documents, his mind already racing through possibilities and consequences. This wasn't about revenge, despite the poetic justice of the situation. This was about Uncle Robert's legacy, about Margaret's principles, about Ethan's future and the futures of every family that depended on Brooks Manufacturing for their livelihood. I'll need your help, Daniel said finally. If we're going to do this right, we'll need documentation of Gerald's decisions, evidence of the problems his management has created. I've been keeping careful records, Linda assured him. Personnel files, financial reports, safety incident reports that Gerald tried to suppress. Everything you'll need to make your case. They parted ways outside the cafe, Linda returning to the office to gather intelligence while Daniel drove home to process the magnitude of what he'd learned. In the space of 24 hours, he'd gone from fired employee to secret majority owner, from victim of corporate callousness to potential architect of corporate transformation. At home, he found Ethan in the garage, tinkering with an old radio they'd been repairing together. His son looked up from his work, wrench in hand, grease on his cheek. Any luck with the job stuff? Ethan asked. Daniel sat beside his son on the worn workbench, thinking about legacy and responsibility, about the difference between authority and leadership. Actually, buddy, I think our luck might just be changing. That evening, as Ethan worked on homework at the kitchen table, Daniel made 3 phone calls. The first was to Uncle Robert's lawyer, requesting an emergency meeting to review his shareholder rights. The second was to Carlos Mendez, asking him to quietly document worker concerns about current management. The third was to the corporate secretary at Brooks Manufacturing, formally requesting a special board meeting. Gerald Kane's world was about to change dramatically. He just didn't know it yet. The law offices of Whitman, Cobb & Associates occupied 3 floors of a downtown building that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless business empires, its marble lobby polished to a mirror shine that reflected both ambition and desperation with equal clarity. Daniel Brooks sat in the waiting area, his work clothes replaced by the only suit he owned, purchased years ago for Margaret's funeral, and worn since only for job interviews and parent-teacher conferences. The leather portfolio in his lap contained documents that would change everything if he had the courage to use them. Robert Whitman III emerged from the elevator precisely at their scheduled appointment time, his silver hair and hand-tailored suit projecting the kind of understated authority that came from representing old money for 3 generations. He guided Daniel to a conference room where afternoon sunlight filtered through windows that overlooked the factory district, including the Brooks Manufacturing Building where Daniel's former colleagues were finishing another shift under Gerald Kane's increasingly harsh management. "Your uncle was very specific about these provisions," Whitman said, spreading additional documents across the polished conference table. "He anticipated that circumstances might arise where you'd need to exercise your authority as majority shareholder. These papers give you complete legal standing to call emergency board meetings, review all corporate decisions, and if necessary, remove executive leadership." Daniel studied the shareholder agreement, noting clauses he'd missed during Linda's abbreviated explanation. Uncle Robert had been thorough, creating safeguards that would protect both Daniel's interests and the company's long-term stability. "What about Gerald's contract? Can he challenge this legally?" Mr. Kane signed his employment agreement under the assumption that he was majority owner, but the contract itself acknowledges the supremacy of actual shareholder authority. Once you reveal your position, his authority becomes subordinate to yours. Whitman leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel with the same careful attention he'd once given Uncle Robert. "The question isn't whether you can do this legally. The question is whether you're prepared for the consequences." An hour later, Daniel drove through the working-class neighborhood where most of Brooks Manufacturing's employees lived, past modest houses with carefully tended gardens and pickup trucks and driveways, past corner stores where workers cashed their paychecks and bought groceries with whatever remained after rent and utilities. These were the people whose livelihoods hung in the balance, whose families would suffer if Gerald's acquisition plans moved forward. He parked outside Carlos Mendez's house, a small ranch-style home that Carlos had been buying one mortgage payment at a time for the past 12 years. Through the kitchen window, Daniel could see Carlos's wife Maria helping their teenage daughter with homework, while Carlos himself worked at the dining room table, probably reviewing the union grievances that had been piling up under Gerald's management. "Danny!" Carlos opened the door before Daniel could knock, his weathered face breaking into a grin that didn't quite hide the worry lines that had deepened over the past year. "Come in, man. Maria's got coffee on." The Mendez family kitchen felt like a haven, its walls covered with children's artwork, school photos, and family celebrations spanning 2 decades. Carlos had worked at Brooks Manufacturing for as long as Daniel, starting the same week 15 years ago, when they'd both been young men with dreams of steady work and growing families. They'd supported each other through plant shutdowns, management changes, and personal tragedies, their friendship forged in the shared understanding of what it meant to depend on a paycheck for survival. "Maria, you remember Danny Brooks," Carlos said as his wife emerged from the living room where she'd been helping their daughter with algebra. "Of course." Maria's embrace was warm but brief, her teacher's instincts picking up on the tension that followed Daniel like a shadow. "I was sorry to hear about yesterday. What Gerald did was wrong, and everyone knows it." They settled around the kitchen table with coffee that had been brewing since dawn, the kind of strong, practical beverage that sustained people through long days and difficult conversations. Carlos produced a notebook filled with his careful handwriting, pages of documented complaints and safety concerns that had been ignored or dismissed by Gerald's administration. "It's gotten bad, Danny, really bad." Carlos flipped through pages that chronicled a steady decline in working conditions, morale, and basic respect for the workforce. Last month, Gerald eliminated the safety bonus program, said it was rewarding workers for doing what they should do anyway. 3 guys quit that week. Daniel reviewed the documentation, recognizing names and faces of people he'd worked alongside for years. Tom Bradley, who'd trained half the current workforce, had been written up for, quote, excessive mentoring time. Jenny Martinez from accounting had been reprimanded for helping workers understand their benefit options. Frank Sullivan, a 20-year veteran, had been suspended for questioning a cost-cutting measure that eliminated required safety equipment. "He's planning layoffs," Daniel said quietly, "massive ones. Linda thinks half the workforce could be gone by Christmas." Carlos set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his knuckles white against the ceramic. "I knew it. He's been having closed-door meetings with suits from Hartwell Industries. Word is they're talking acquisition. What would that mean for everyone? For the workers, it means we're screwed." Carlos's voice carried 15 years of accumulated frustration. "Hartwell runs lean operations. They'll keep maybe a third of us, probably move most production to their facility in Mississippi where labor's cheaper. This neighborhood, these families, we'd all be history." Maria placed a protective hand on her husband's shoulder. Carlos has been talking to the other supervisors. They're thinking about organizing, maybe going to the union with formal complaints. Union can't do much against an acquisition, Carlos said bitterly. Once Hartwell owns us, they can restructure however they want. Legal layoffs, plant closure, whatever maximizes their profit. Daniel thought about Uncle Robert's letter, about the responsibility that came with unexpected power. What if I told you there might be another way? A way to stop Gerald before the acquisition goes through? Carlos studied his friend's face with the intensity of someone who'd learned not to trust easy promises. What kind of way? I can't explain everything yet, but I'm calling a special board meeting. There are things about the company's ownership structure that Gerald doesn't understand. Things that could change the entire situation. You got some kind of legal challenge? Something about wrongful termination? Daniel chose his words carefully. Something like that. But I need documentation of everything Gerald's done wrong. Every policy change that's hurt workers. Every safety issue he's ignored. Can you help me gather that information? Carlos grinned for the first time since Daniel's arrival. Brother, I've been documenting Gerald's screw-ups for 2 years. Give me until tomorrow night, and I'll have you a file thick enough to choke a horse. They spent the next hour reviewing specific incidents, with Carlos providing context for decisions that had seemed arbitrary or vindictive. Gerald's management style emerged as a pattern of deliberate demoralization, each policy change designed to squeeze maximum productivity while minimizing cost, regardless of human impact. He actually told Jenkins that if workers wanted job security, they should have gotten better educations, Carlos recounted, his voice thick with disgust. This from a guy who's never worked a day on a production floor in his life. As Daniel prepared to leave, Maria caught his arm. Danny, whatever you're planning, be careful. Gerald's got connections, political pull. He's not the kind of man who loses gracefully. I know. But sometimes, doing the right thing means taking risks. The drive home took Daniel through the downtown district, where Brooks Manufacturing's corporate offices cast long shadows over the surrounding blocks. The building had been Uncle Robert's pride, designed with large windows and open spaces that reflected his belief that work should be dignified, that employees deserved environments that honored their contributions rather than merely extracting their labor. Gerald had changed that atmosphere incrementally, replacing Uncle Robert's collaborative culture with something colder, more calculated. Executive bonuses had increased while worker benefits decreased. Safety training had been streamlined to the point of uselessness. The employee recognition programs that had once celebrated long service and innovative thinking had been eliminated as, quote, unnecessary overhead. At home, Daniel found Ethan in the garage again, this time working on a mechanical drawing that showed remarkable sophistication for a 10-year-old. The design appeared to be some kind of automated quality control system, with sensors and sorting mechanisms that could identify defective parts before they reached customers. What's this one for? Daniel asked, settling beside his son on the workbench. I was thinking about what you said yesterday, about wanting to improve things at your old job. Ethan looked up from his work, his young face serious with concentration. Maybe if factories had better ways to catch mistakes early, they wouldn't have to waste so much money fixing things later. Daniel studied the drawing, amazed by his son's intuitive understanding of manufacturing challenges. This is really smart thinking, buddy. Where did you learn about quality control? Library books, and I've been watching some engineering videos online. Ethan hesitated, then added, Dad, are you really done working at that place? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Daniel heard his son's real concern. Would their financial situation stabilize? Would they have to move? Would the foundation of their small family prove strong enough to weather this crisis? I don't know yet, Daniel answered honestly. But I promise you this, whatever happens next, we're going to be okay. And if I do go back to that company, it's going to be as someone who can actually make the changes you're designing here. That evening, while Ethan completed his homework, Daniel made a series of phone calls that would set the next phase of his plan in motion. The first was to Linda Carver, arranging to meet the following morning to review Gerald's recent decisions in detail. The second was to the corporate secretary, formally requesting an emergency board meeting for Friday afternoon. The third was to Robert Whitman, asking him to prepare the legal documentation that would prove Daniel's majority ownership beyond any possible challenge. By the time he tucked Ethan into bed, Daniel had committed himself to a course of action that would either restore Brooks Manufacturing to its original purpose or explode his life in spectacular fashion. There would be no middle ground, no compromised position that allowed him to remain safely anonymous while others fought battles on his behalf. As he sat in the kitchen reviewing Carlos's preliminary notes, Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a mantle passed down through generations. Uncle Robert had trusted him with more than just financial inheritance. He'd been given stewardship of an ideal, a vision of what business could be when it prioritized people over pure profit. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Gerald Kane's reign of cold efficiency was about to meet its first serious challenge, though he wouldn't understand the full scope of that challenge until it was far too late to mount an effective defense. The game was changing, and for the first time in 15 years, Daniel Brooks held the winning hand. The executive conference room at Brooks Manufacturing had been designed to intimidate, its mahogany table stretching 20 feet beneath a crystal chandelier that cast sharp shadows across faces accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. Gerald Kane sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, his Italian leather portfolio open to reveal charts showing quarterly projections and cost reduction strategies that would make shareholders happy and workers expendable. The board members filed in with the careful choreography of people who understood power dynamics, each taking their assigned seats according to an unspoken hierarchy that placed Gerald's allies closest to his position of authority. Richard Novak from the bank sat to Gerald's right, his conservative suit and gold watch reflecting the financial institutions that kept the company's credit lines open. Sandra Wade, the consulting firm representative, claimed the seat across from him, her tablet already displaying efficiency metrics that reduced human labor to statistical abstractions. Daniel Brooks entered last, carrying the leather portfolio that Robert Whitman had prepared, its contents representing the legal foundation for everything that would follow. He wore his father's old suit, pressed and cleaned but obviously second-hand, a visual reminder that he belonged to the working world rather than the executive class that controlled it. Gerald looked up from his papers with barely concealed irritation. "Mr. Brooks, I'm not sure why you requested this meeting, but I hope you understand that board time is valuable. If this is about your termination, the decision was final and based on clear policy violations." "Actually, it's about company leadership," Daniel replied, settling into the chair directly across from Gerald. "Specifically about decisions being made without proper shareholder consultation." A murmur of confusion rippled around the table. Board members exchanged glances, clearly wondering why a recently fired operations manager would presume to discuss shareholder issues. Gerald's smile carried the cold satisfaction of someone about to crush an annoying insect. "Mr. Brooks, I think you misunderstand the corporate structure here. Shareholder concerns are addressed through proper channels, not by former employees who own 51% of the company," Daniel interrupted, sliding the shareholder documentation across the table. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft whisper of papers being examined and the distant hum of machinery from the factory floor below. Gerald's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning horror, as the legal documents revealed the truth he'd never suspected. "This is impossible," Gerald said, his voice losing its authoritative edge. "Robert Brooks left me controlling interest when he died. The lawyers confirmed that you inherited 49%, Daniel corrected. My uncle retained 51% until his death, then passed it to me according to provisions in his will that were kept confidential until circumstances required their disclosure." Richard Novak examined the documents with the careful attention of someone who'd reviewed countless corporate agreements. "These appear to be authentic. Whitman, Cobb has been handling Brooks' family legal matters for decades." Sandra Way's tablet reflected her rapid calculations as she processed the implications. "If these documents are valid, Mr. Kane, your authority as CEO exists at the pleasure of Mr. Brooks as majority shareholder." Gerald's perfectly composed mask began to crack, revealing something desperate and ugly underneath. "This is ridiculous. You can't just walk in here after being fired and claim ownership of a company you've never managed beyond the operations level." "I'm not claiming ownership," Daniel said quietly. "I'm exercising it. For 2 years, I've watched this company move away from its founding principles, away from the values my uncle built into its foundation: workers treated like disposable assets, safety protocols eliminated to save money, employee benefits cut while executive compensation increased. Daniel opened his portfolio, revealing the documentation Carlos had helped him compile. In the past 18 months, under current management, we've lost 3 major contracts due to quality issues that could have been prevented with proper investment in equipment and training. Worker satisfaction has dropped to its lowest level in company history. Turnover has increased 40%. Those are normal market adjustments, Gerald protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Competitive pressures require difficult decisions. Competitive pressures require smart decisions, Daniel countered. Decisions that consider long-term sustainability instead of short-term profit maximization. My uncle didn't build this company to be a machine for extracting maximum value from workers. He built it to provide stable employment while delivering quality products. Board member Patricia Collins, who'd known Uncle Robert personally, leaned forward with interest. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Brooks?" "I'm proposing a return to the leadership principles that made this company successful for 30 years before recent management changes." Daniel met each board member's eyes in turn. Investment in worker training and safety. Profit sharing that gives employees stake in company success. And decision-making that considers community impact alongside shareholder returns. Gerald's desperation erupted into anger. "This is emotional nonsense. Business requires discipline, not sentiment. If you implement these idealistic policies, you'll bankrupt the company within 2 years." "The policies I'm describing built this company from nothing to its current position," Daniel replied. "They're not idealistic, they're proven. The decline we've experienced correlates directly with abandoning those principles." Richard Novak studied the financial projections Gerald had prepared for the board meeting. "Mr. Kane, these numbers show projected layoffs of nearly 50% within 6 months. Is that accurate?" Gerald shifted uncomfortably. "Market conditions require operational streamlining. The Hartwell acquisition would provide economy of scale that would eliminate most local jobs while maximizing profit for outside investors." Daniel finished. "Mr. Kane has been negotiating this acquisition without consulting the majority shareholder, which constitutes a violation of corporate governance requirements." Sandra Way's expression grew thoughtful as she processed the competitive implications. "Mr. Brooks, what's your alternative to the acquisition strategy?" "Internal growth based on quality improvement and worker investment," Daniel said, producing Ethan's mechanical drawings from his portfolio. "My son designed this quality control system as a school project. A 10-year-old identified efficiency improvements that could save us thousands in waste reduction. Imagine what our experienced workforce could accomplish with proper support and incentive structure." Patricia Collins examined the drawings with growing amazement. "This is remarkably sophisticated for a child's work. It represents the kind of innovative thinking that emerges when people feel valued and empowered," Daniel explained. "Current management practices suppress that creativity in favor of rigid compliance with predetermined metrics." Gerald made one final attempt to regain control. "The board can't seriously consider replacing proven business leadership with sentimental theories proposed by a factory supervisor with no executive experience." "Operations manager," Daniel corrected, "and 15 years of practical experience working with the people who actually make this company function. I know every process, every safety concern, every inefficiency that impacts our bottom line. More importantly, I understand the difference between leadership and management." The room fell silent as board members considered the fundamental choice before them. Gerald represented the conventional wisdom of modern corporate culture: maximum efficiency, minimal sentiment, quarterly results that satisfied distant shareholders regardless of local impact. Daniel represented something older and less fashionable: the belief that sustainable business success required treating workers as partners rather than resources to be optimized. Richard Novak spoke first. "As the financial representative, I have to ask about the practical implications. Mr. Brooks, can you provide specific projections for your proposed changes?" "I can provide something better," Daniel replied. "A track record. For 15 years, every department I've managed has exceeded safety standards, met production quotas, and maintained worker satisfaction above company average. The principles I'm proposing aren't theoretical. They're proven at the operational level." Sandra Way closed her tablet, her expression reflecting a decision that surprised even her. The consulting firm I represent has been advocating for employee engagement strategies that align closely with what Mr. Brooks is describing. Recent studies show that companies with high worker satisfaction consistently outperform those focused solely on cost reduction. One by one, the board members indicated their support for Daniel's vision, their votes reflecting not just financial calculations but a recognition that the company's original values had produced decades of stability and growth. Gerald's isolation became complete as even his closest allies acknowledged that his management approach had failed to deliver promised results. The vote is unanimous, Patricia Collins announced. Daniel Brooks is confirmed as CEO and chairman of the board, with authority to implement leadership changes as he deems necessary. Gerald sat in stunned silence, his world reordering itself around the reality that the man he'd fired as inadequate now held complete authority over his professional future. The irony was perfect and devastating. The executive who'd lectured about sacrifice and commitment had just been outmaneuvered by someone who'd actually demonstrated those qualities. "Gerald," Daniel said quietly, "your employment contract remains valid, but your role will change. I'd like you to stay as operations consultant, working directly with Linda Carver to implement the policy changes we've discussed." The offer was generous beyond what Gerald deserved, and everyone in the room understood the message it sent. Daniel Brooks would lead through inclusion rather than exclusion, through building up rather than tearing down. Even his enemies would be given opportunities to contribute constructively. As the board meeting concluded, Daniel felt the weight of authority settling on his shoulders like a mantle passed down through generations. Uncle Robert's faith had been justified, Margaret's principles had been honored, and Ethan's future had been secured. But the real work was just beginning. Outside the conference room windows, the factory floor hummed with activity as workers finished their shifts, unaware that their employment security had just been guaranteed by decisions made in a room they'd never seen by people they'd rarely met. Tomorrow, Daniel would walk among them not as a fired colleague, but as someone with the power to transform their daily reality. The quiet man who'd preferred anonymity to authority was about to discover what leadership really meant when backed by both legal power and moral purpose. The factory floor at 7 o'clock Monday morning buzzed with an energy Daniel hadn't felt in years. Workers moving through their routines with the efficient choreography of people who understood their roles and took pride in their craftsmanship. The overnight shift was wrapping up their final quality checks while the day crew filtered in through the main entrance, lunch boxes and coffee thermoses in hand, ready for another day of transforming raw materials into products that would serve customers across 3 states. Daniel walked the familiar aisles between machinery that had been his second home for 15 years, but everything felt different now. Where once he'd moved with the careful deference of middle management, avoiding decisions that might upset the delicate balance of corporate politics, he now carried the authority to make real changes, to address problems that had festered under Gerald's cost-cutting regime. The first stop was Station 7, where Jenny Martinez operated a precision cutting machine that had been acting up for months. Under Gerald's leadership, repairs had been deferred repeatedly, forcing Jenny to compensate with manual adjustments that slowed production and increased the risk of injury. "Morning, Jenny," Daniel said, approaching her workstation. "How's our temperamental friend behaving today?" Jenny looked up from her work, surprise flickering across her face at seeing Daniel in the plant so early after his supposed termination. Word traveled fast on the factory floor, but corporate decisions usually took days to filter down to the actual workers. "Same as always, Mr. Brooks. Cutting about 2 degrees off true, so I have to manually correct every piece." She gestured at the small pile of metal shavings that accumulated from each adjustment. "I mentioned it to Supervisor Williams, but he said maintenance requests have to go through the new approval process." Daniel pulled out his phone and called the maintenance department directly. "This is Daniel Brooks. I need a full diagnostic on the Station 7 cutting machine today, with repairs completed by end of shift." "Yes, I'm authorizing the expense personally. Thank you." Jenny stared at him with growing confusion. "Mr. Brooks, I thought you were." "It's a long story," Daniel said with a smile. "The important thing is that you shouldn't have to fight broken equipment to do your job well. By tomorrow morning, this machine will be cutting true." Word of Daniel's presence spread through the plant like wildfire, workers clustering in small groups to whisper questions and theories about what his return might mean. Daniel made his way to the break room, where the morning shift was gathering for the daily safety briefing that Gerald had reduced from 15 minutes to 5 in the interest of productive efficiency. Carlos Mendez stood at the front of the group, clipboard in hand, his weathered face showing the strain of trying to maintain morale under increasingly difficult conditions. When he spotted Daniel in the doorway, his expression shifted from resigned professionalism to something approaching hope. "Looks like we've got a visitor this morning," Carlos announced to the assembled workers. "Danny Brooks is back, and I'm guessing he's got something to say." 23 faces turned toward Daniel, representing 23 families whose financial security depended on decisions made in boardrooms they'd never see by executives they'd rarely meet. These were the people Uncle Robert had built the company to serve, the skilled craftsmen whose expertise transformed raw materials into products that competed successfully in markets dominated by larger competitors with cheaper labor. "Most of you know I was let go Friday for taking leave to care for my sick son," Daniel began, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room. "What you don't know is that I own this company, inherited it from my uncle 2 years ago, but kept it quiet because I preferred working alongside you rather than above you." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of machinery and the soft whistle of air conditioning. Frank Sullivan, a 20-year veteran with calloused hands and sharp eyes, spoke first. "You saying you're the boss now?" "I'm saying I've always been the owner, but now I'm going to act like it." Daniel moved closer to the group, making eye contact with workers he'd known for years. "Gerald Kane fired me for putting family before company profits. That tells you everything you need to know about his priorities." Maria Santos, who'd been with the company for 8 years, raised her hand tentatively. "What does this mean for us, for our jobs?" "It means the layoffs Gerald was planning are canceled. It means the safety bonus program is reinstated. It means we're going to invest in equipment maintenance and worker training instead of squeezing every penny out of operations until something breaks." A murmur of cautious optimism rippled through the group. These were people who'd learned not to trust promises from management, who'd watched benefits disappear and working conditions deteriorate under the banner of necessary efficiency improvements. Tom Bradley, the senior supervisor who'd trained half the current workforce, stepped forward. "Danny, we've all heard talk about Hartwell Industries, about some kind of acquisition deal. Is that still happening?" "Not as long as I have anything to say about it," Daniel replied firmly. "Hartwell wants to buy us so they can close this plant and move production to their facility in Mississippi. That's not going to happen." Carlos grinned for the first time in months. "So what you're telling us is that the guy who fired you for being a good father just got fired by the guy he fired?" The laughter that erupted felt like a dam breaking, releasing months of accumulated tension and frustration. Workers began asking questions about specific problems they'd been afraid to mention under Gerald's regime, safety concerns that had been dismissed, efficiency suggestions that had been ignored, equipment issues that had been deferred until they became crisis situations. "We're going to address all of it," Daniel promised, "but I need your help. I need to know about every problem, every inefficiency, every way we can improve both working conditions and product quality. This company succeeds when you succeed." The meeting ran long as workers shared concerns they'd been bottling up for months. The ventilation system in Building C that hadn't worked properly since winter. The training program for new hires that had been cut to 2 days from the previous week-long curriculum. The employee suggestion box that had been eliminated as, quote, unnecessary bureaucracy. After the workers dispersed to their stations, Daniel found himself walking through the plant with a growing understanding of how much damage Gerald's efficiency-focused management had done. Equipment that should have been maintained monthly had been serviced quarterly. Safety protocols that had been refined over decades had been simplified to the point of uselessness. The profit-sharing program that had given workers stake in company success had been eliminated to improve quarterly numbers. His phone buzzed with a text from Linda Carver. "Gerald's meeting with Hartwell Industries this afternoon. He doesn't know about the board vote yet." Daniel smiled grimly. Gerald was about to discover that the acquisition he'd been negotiating would require approval from the very person he'd fired for valuing family over corporate loyalty. The irony was perfect, but Daniel took no pleasure in his former boss's impending humiliation. Revenge had never been the point. Restoring the company to its founding principles was. The lunch whistle sounded at exactly 12 o'clock, summoning workers to the cafeteria where they gathered in informal groups, determined by years of shared experience and mutual respect. Daniel joined Carlos at a table near the windows overlooking the parking lot, where workers, pickup trucks, and practical sedans reflected the blue-collar values that had built the company's reputation for reliability and craftsmanship. "Oh, you know this is going to be harder than you think," Carlos said, unwrapping a sandwich his wife had packed that morning. "Gerald's got allies on the board, people who believe his version of business efficiency. They're not going to disappear just because you've got majority ownership." "I know, but I've also got something Gerald never had, the support of the people who actually make this company work." Daniel gestured toward the workers scattered throughout the cafeteria. Their conversations focused on family, weekend plans, and the small details of lives built around honest work and steady paychecks. What about Gerald himself? You can't just fire him without cause, and he's smart enough to lawyer up if you try. Daniel had been thinking about that problem since the board meeting. Gerald's employment contract was ironclad, negotiated during his honeymoon period after Uncle Robert's death, when the board had believed they needed his expertise to maintain stability. Firing him would require documented cause, and personal animosity wouldn't be sufficient legal justification. "I'm not going to fire him," Daniel said finally. "I'm going to give him exactly what he says he wants. The chance to prove his business theories work in practice." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "Meaning what?" "Meaning Gerald gets to run the Hartwell acquisition project as special consultant. He can negotiate the deal, present it to the board, and demonstrate the financial benefits of his efficiency-focused approach." Daniel's smile carried an edge that would have worried Gerald if he'd been there to see it. "Of course, the board will vote on any acquisition based on majority shareholder recommendation, which you control, which I control. Gerald gets to pursue his vision, and I get to demonstrate why it's wrong for this company and these workers." The afternoon brought a steady stream of problems that had been deferred or ignored under Gerald's management. The payroll system that miscalculated overtime hours. The insurance forms that required manual processing because the computerized system had been downgraded to save money. The worker complaint procedure that had been eliminated in favor of an anonymous suggestion box that was emptied monthly instead of weekly. Each problem revealed the same pattern: short-term cost savings that created long-term inefficiencies and worker dissatisfaction. Gerald's management philosophy treated symptoms while ignoring underlying causes, maximizing immediate profit while undermining the foundation of sustainable business success. At 4 o'clock, Daniel's phone rang with a call from Linda Carver. "Gerald's back from his Hartwell meeting. He's requesting an emergency board session to approve the acquisition. Should I schedule it?" "Absolutely. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Make sure all board members receive copies of Gerald's proposal in advance." "Daniel, are you sure about this?" "Gerald's presentation is going to be very convincing from a pure numbers standpoint." "I'm counting on it." Gerald's about to get exactly what he's been asking for. The chance to prove his approach is better than mine. That evening, Daniel sat with Ethan at the kitchen table, helping with homework while reviewing the acquisition documents Linda had forwarded. Gerald's proposal was masterfully crafted, projecting cost savings and profit increases that would make any traditional board of directors salivate with anticipation. "What's all that paperwork?" Ethan asked, looking up from his math problems. "It's a proposal to sell our company to a bigger one," Daniel explained. "The man who fired me thinks it would be good for business." "Would it be good for the workers?" Daniel smiled at his son's instinctive concern for the people who actually did the work. "No, buddy. It would eliminate most of their jobs." "Then why would anyone think it's a good idea?" "Because some people think business is just about making money, not about taking care of the people who make the money possible." Ethan considered this with the seriousness of someone far older than his 10 years. "Mom always said you can tell what people really believe by watching what they do when they think nobody's looking." Margaret's wisdom, filtered through their son's clear-eyed observation, hit Daniel like a physical blow. Tomorrow's board meeting would reveal what Gerald really believed about leadership, about responsibility, about the purpose of business in a community that depended on stable employment for survival. The game was set. Gerald would present his vision of efficient, profit-maximizing corporate management. Daniel would counter with Uncle Robert's belief that sustainable business success required treating workers as partners rather than costs to be minimized. Only one philosophy could prevail, and the vote would determine not just the company's future but the fate of every family that depended on Brooks Manufacturing for their livelihood. Gerald Kane was about to discover that firing the wrong person could cost you everything. The alarm shrieked through Building C at 6:47 a.m., its piercing wail cutting through the steady hum of production machinery like a knife through silence. Daniel Brooks was reviewing morning reports in his temporary office when the sound reached him, followed immediately by Carlos Mendez, voice crackling over the plant-wide intercom. Production line shut down Building C, all supervisors to Station 12 immediately. Daniel reached the production floor to find controlled chaos. Workers had evacuated their stations according to safety protocol, gathering in designated areas while supervisors assessed the situation. The massive stamping press that formed the company's signature steel components sat silent, its computer display flashing error codes that spelled disaster in digital red. "What's the situation?" Daniel asked, approaching the cluster of maintenance staff surrounding the machine. Frank Sullivan looked up from his diagnostic tablet, his weathered face grim with professional concern. "Main hydraulic system failure. Pressure seals gave way during the overnight run, flooded the electrical controls, machines completely down." The implications hit Daniel like a physical blow. Station 12 processed components for the Morrison contract, the same contract Gerald had claimed Daniel's absence had jeopardized. Without this machine operational, they'd miss delivery deadlines that could cost the company its largest client and provide Gerald with ammunition for his acquisition arguments. "How long to repair?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. "Normal circumstances? 3 days minimum," Frank replied. "We'd need to drain the hydraulic system, replace the seals, dry out all the electrical components, recalibrate the pressure sensors. That's assuming we can get parts shipped priority." "What about abnormal circumstances?" Frank exchanged glances with his maintenance crew, men who'd spent decades keeping temperamental machinery operational through ingenuity and determination. "If we work around the clock, bypass some of the automated safety checks, maybe we could get her running in 18 hours. But it would be risky." Daniel pulled out his phone, checking the delivery schedule Linda had forwarded that morning. The Morrison shipment was due Thursday afternoon, 36 hours away. If they could get the machine operational by Wednesday morning, they might salvage the contract that represented 15% of the company's annual revenue. "What do you need?" Daniel asked. "Permission to authorize emergency overtime for all shifts," Frank said. "Parts expedited from Chicago at premium shipping rates. And someone willing to take responsibility if we cut corners on safety protocols." Daniel thought about Gerald's presentation that afternoon, about the board members who would weigh the acquisition proposal based on the company's operational efficiency. A failed delivery would support every argument Gerald had made about the need for corporate restructuring and external management expertise. "You've got it," Daniel said. "Whatever it takes." The next 18 hours became a masterclass in crisis leadership. Daniel shed his suit jacket and tie, rolling up his sleeves to work alongside mechanics whose expertise had been devalued under Gerald's efficiency-focused management. He held flashlights while Frank diagnosed electrical problems, ran for tools when seconds mattered, and coordinated with suppliers who normally dealt only with purchasing departments. Word spread through the plant that the new owner was working the floor like any other employee, solving problems instead of assigning blame. Workers volunteered for additional shifts without being asked, understanding that their collective effort would determine whether the company remained independent or fell victim to Gerald's acquisition plans. At midnight, Daniel found himself in the break room with the third shift crew, sharing coffee that had been brewing since dinner and sandwiches that Carlos's wife had sent for anyone too busy to go home for meals. The camaraderie felt familiar yet different. These were colleagues he'd worked alongside for 15 years, but the dynamics had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. "You know Gerald's gonna blame you for this breakdown," Carlos said, settling beside Daniel on the worn couch where exhausted workers had been catching brief naps between repair tasks. "Probably. Delayed maintenance, inadequate investment in equipment upgrades." Daniel rubbed his eyes, which burned from hours of squinting at hydraulic connections and electrical schematics. "The machine's been showing stress signs for months, but repair requests kept getting deferred." "That's what I mean. He'll say this proves his point about operational inefficiency." Daniel considered the irony. Gerald's cost-cutting measures had created the conditions for this failure, but he would use the failure itself as evidence that more drastic measures were necessary. It was circular logic that would appeal to board members focused on quarterly results rather than long-term sustainability. By dawn, the repair crew had made remarkable progress. New hydraulic seals were installed, electrical systems had been dried and tested, and the machine's computer brain was slowly coming back online. Frank supervised the initial startup sequence with the concentrated attention of a surgeon performing delicate surgery. "Pressure holding steady," announced Maria Santos, who'd volunteered to work a double shift monitoring the hydraulic gauges. "Electrical system showing green across the board." The machine lurched to life with a deep mechanical growl, its massive arms moving through calibration cycles with the precision that had made Brooks Manufacturing's products sought after by clients who valued quality over cost. Workers cheered as the first test piece emerged perfectly formed, meeting specifications that justified the premium prices their craftsmanship commanded. But the celebration was brief. Gerald Kane appeared in the doorway at exactly 7 a.m., his perfectly pressed suit and cold expression providing stark contrast to the oil-stained clothes and exhausted faces of the workers who'd saved the contract through sheer determination. "Interesting approach to crisis management," Gerald said, his voice carrying the tone of someone documenting evidence for future use. "Though I wonder if this heroic effort would have been necessary with proper preventative maintenance protocols." Daniel felt the workers' mood shift, their pride in collective achievement dampened by the implicit criticism. Gerald possessed an uncanny ability to diminish others' accomplishments while positioning himself as the voice of superior wisdom. "The machine's operational, the contracts saved, and the crew performed magnificently." Daniel replied evenly, "That's what matters." "What matters is sustainable operational efficiency," Gerald countered. "Crisis responses might feel heroic, but they're symptoms of systemic management failures. Professional leadership prevents emergencies rather than reacting to them." The words stung because they contained enough truth to be persuasive. Daniel's leadership style emphasized relationships and collective problem-solving, but Gerald's criticism highlighted the fundamental tension between human-centered management and the predictable systems that modern business supposedly required. As workers dispersed to their regular stations, Gerald lingered, his pale eyes studying the repaired machine with the calculating expression of someone building a case for radical change. "The board meeting's at 2 o'clock, Gerald said. "I trust you'll attend to hear Hartwell's acquisition proposal. Their operational efficiency metrics are quite impressive." Daniel nodded, understanding that the morning's crisis had become ammunition for arguments he'd have to counter in a few hours. The machine breakdown would be presented as evidence of organizational dysfunction, the heroic repair effort dismissed as expensive theatrics that professional management would have made unnecessary. The trial by fire had been passed, but the real test was yet to come. The boardroom felt smaller this time, its polished surfaces reflecting the tension that crackled between opposing visions of corporate leadership. Gerald Kane sat at his customary position, surrounded by presentation materials that gleamed with the professional sheen of expensive consulting work. Charts projected quarterly savings, efficiency metrics, and profit projections that made Hartwell Industries' acquisition offer appear not just attractive, but inevitable. Daniel entered carrying a single folder and the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent the previous night proving that leadership meant more than PowerPoint presentations and statistical analysis. His clothes bore faint traces of machine oil despite Linda's suggestion that he change before the meeting, a deliberate reminder that real authority came from understanding how work actually got done. "Before we begin," Gerald announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed victory was assured, "I want to acknowledge the operational crisis that occurred this morning. While the immediate problem was resolved, it perfectly illustrates the systemic inefficiencies that make Hartwell's proposal so compelling." Richard Novak leaned forward with the focused attention of someone whose bank held significant company debt. "What kind of crisis?" "Complete hydraulic failure on our primary stamping press," Gerald replied, consulting notes that reduced 18 hours of collective effort to bullet points on corporate letterhead. "The breakdown threatened our largest contract, required emergency overtime for multiple shifts, and cost approximately $15,000 in expedited repairs and premium shipping." Sandra Way's tablet reflected rapid calculations as she processed the financial impact. "That's a significant operational expense." "It's the cost of deferred maintenance under previous management policies," Gerald continued smoothly. "Hartwell Industries operates with preventative maintenance protocols that would eliminate such failures. Their efficiency metrics show 97% uptime across all facilities." Daniel waded through Gerald's presentation, Listening to familiar problems reduced to abstract numbers that obscured the human effort required to solve them. The overnight repair work was dismissed as, quote, crisis management, the workers' expertise devalued as inefficient compared to Hartwell's standardized procedures. The acquisition offer reflects current market valuations, Gerald concluded, revealing figures that would provide handsome returns for shareholders while eliminating most local employment. Hartwell's management team has extensive experience optimizing operations through strategic workforce reduction and facility consolidation. Patricia Collins studied the financial projections with the careful attention of someone who remembered when the company had been built on different principles. These numbers are impressive, but what about community impact? This facility employs nearly 200 people. Business decisions must be based on competitive reality rather than sentimental considerations, Gerald replied. Hartwell's Mississippi facility offers significant labor cost advantages and proximity to major transportation networks. Daniel opened his folder, extracting documents that told a different story about operational efficiency and competitive advantage. I'd like to present an alternative analysis. Mr. Brooks, while your ownership position gives you voting authority, I think the board should hear all perspectives before making decisions that affect 200 families, Daniel interrupted quietly. He stood, moving to the presentation screen where Gerald's chart still glowed with the promise of maximum profit extraction. Hartwell's efficiency metrics don't account for the hidden costs of workforce turnover, lost institutional knowledge, and community relationship deterioration. Daniel's first slide showed retention statistics spanning 15 years, demonstrating how worker loyalty had translated into consistent quality and customer satisfaction. Our average employee tenure is 8 years. Hartwell's facilities average 18 months. Training costs alone offset their projected labor savings. Anecdotal data, Gerald dismissed. Professional management systems reduce dependence on individual expertise. Do they? Daniel clicked to the next slide, showing customer feedback scores that had declined steadily under Gerald's management. The Morrison contract we nearly lost this morning? They've been our client for 12 years because they value the craftsmanship that comes from experienced workers who take pride in their output. Sandra Way frowned at her tablet calculations. The customer retention numbers are concerning. Hartwell's proposal assumes existing contracts would transfer automatically. Based on price competitiveness, Gerald insisted, Hartwell's cost structure allows for significant pricing advantages. Daniel smiled, remembering conversations with clients who'd explained why they chose Brooks Manufacturing despite higher costs. Price isn't everything in our market segment. We compete on quality, reliability, and service flexibility that larger facilities can't match. He clicked to testimonials from major customers, quotes that emphasized the value of working with suppliers who understood their specific needs and could adapt quickly to changing requirements. The corporate efficiency that Hartwell promised would eliminate exactly the responsiveness that justified premium pricing. This morning's crisis illustrates my point perfectly, Daniel continued. When the hydraulic system failed, we had the machine operational within 18 hours because our people understand the equipment intimately and care about the outcome personally. Hartwell's standardized procedures would have required 3 days minimum. Richard Novak looked up from calculations that were clearly revising his assumptions. The overtime costs versus lost contract revenue. The emergency repair actually saved money? Significantly. The Morrison contract represents $200,000 in revenue. Missing delivery would have cost us both immediate income and long-term relationship damage that's impossible to quantify. Gerald's composure began showing cracks as board members asked questions his presentation hadn't anticipated. Isolated incidents shouldn't drive strategic decisions. Hartwell's systematic approach prevents such emergencies. By replacing experienced workers with standardized procedures, Daniel replied. But our competitive advantage comes from exactly the expertise and commitment that systematic approaches eliminate. Patricia Collins studied both presentations with growing thoughtfulness. Mr. Brooks, what's your long-term vision for independent operation? Daniel had prepared for this question, understanding that emotional appeals wouldn't convince board members focused on fiduciary responsibility. Controlled growth based on our reputation for quality and service. Investment in worker training and equipment upgrades that maintain our competitive differentiation. He outlined specific proposals. Profit sharing that gave workers stake in company success. apprenticeship programs that developed expertise internally, equipment investments that improved both productivity and working conditions. The vision required patience and faith in human potential, rather than quick returns and statistical optimization. The financial projections show modest but sustainable growth, Daniel concluded. More importantly, they show a business model that strengthens rather than exploits the community relationships that have sustained us for 30 years. The room fell silent as board members considered fundamentally different approaches to corporate success. Gerald's proposal offered immediate returns in corporate efficiency that satisfied traditional business metrics. Daniel's vision required faith that treating workers as partners rather than costs would produce superior long-term results. Sandra Way spoke first, her voice reflecting professional analysis rather than personal preference. The customer retention data suggests significant risk in Hartwell's operational assumptions. If existing contracts don't transfer as projected, the acquisition's financial benefits disappear. Richard Novak nodded slowly. The debt service implications also favor stability over rapid change. Our current banking relationships reflect confidence in established management and operational continuity. One by one, board members voiced support for maintaining independence under Daniel's leadership. Gerald's isolation became complete as even his closest allies acknowledged that his efficiency-focused approach had failed to deliver promised results while creating operational vulnerabilities. The vote is unanimous, Patricia Collins announced. Brooks Manufacturing remains independent under Daniel Brooks' leadership. The Hartwell acquisition is rejected. Gerald sat in stunned silence, his carefully constructed presentation reduced to irrelevance by analysis that valued relationships over pure efficiency. The man who'd fired Daniel for valuing family over corporate loyalty had just been defeated by arguments that prioritized workers over shareholders. "Gerald," Daniel said quietly, "I'd like you to stay as operations consultant. Your analytical skills and industry connections are valuable, even if we disagree about leadership philosophy." The offer was generous beyond what Gerald deserved, demonstrating the difference between leadership that built bridges and management that burned them. Gerald's response would reveal whether he could adapt to serving rather than ruling. The meeting ended with Daniel, holding authority he'd never sought, responsible for decisions that would affect not just quarterly returns, but the daily lives of families who depended on steady work for survival. Uncle Robert's faith had been justified, but the real test lay ahead, proving that business success and human dignity weren't mutually exclusive in an economy that increasingly demanded choosing between them. The employee meeting hall hadn't been used for its intended purpose in 3 years, Gerald's efficiency measures having eliminated the monthly gatherings where workers could voice concerns and share suggestions with management. Dust motes danced in afternoon sunlight, as Daniel surveyed the space where Uncle Robert had once held company-wide discussions about everything from safety protocols to profit-sharing distributions. Tables arranged in a large circle replaced the theater-style seating that Gerald had preferred, a physical representation of the collaborative approach Daniel intended to implement. Linda Carver worked with maintenance staff to test the sound system while Carlos Mendez helped arrange materials that would outline the company's new direction. Workers filed in with the cautious optimism of people who'd learned not to trust promises from management but desperately wanted reasons for hope. They took seats with familiar patterns, the machine operators clustering near the front, the maintenance crew claiming tables along the wall, the office staff settling into positions that reflected years of unspoken hierarchy. Daniel stood at the center of the circle rather than behind a podium, his position emphasizing conversation over presentation. "3 days ago I told you I owned this company. Today I want to talk about what that means for all of us." Frank Sullivan raised his hand, his weathered face skeptical despite recent improvements in working conditions. "Danny, we've heard promises before. How do we know this isn't just temporary until things settle down?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words, reflecting years of disappointment when management changes had promised improvements that never materialized. Daniel understood that trust would be earned through consistent action rather than inspiring speeches. "Because I'm putting it in writing," Daniel replied, gesturing to Linda, who distributed copies of the new employee handbook. "Profit-sharing returns to the original formula Uncle Robert established. Safety bonuses are permanent policy, not temporary incentives. And I'm creating an employee advisory council with real authority to influence company decisions." Maria Santos examined the profit-sharing formula with the careful attention of someone who'd watched benefits disappear under previous management. This says we share 20% of annual profits. That's more than we had even under Mr. Robert. The company's success depends on your skills and commitment, Daniel explained. It's only fair that you share in the results of your work. Tom Bradley, who'd trained countless new employees over 20 years, leaned forward with interest. What about the apprenticeship program? Gerald eliminated it to cut training costs. Reinstated and expanded, Daniel confirmed. We're partnering with the community college to offer certification programs that give workers portable skills while meeting our need for specialized expertise. The announcement sparked murmurs of excitement among younger workers who'd been hired without proper training under Gerald's streamlined protocols. The apprenticeship program represented more than job security. It offered pathways to advancement that had been eliminated in favor of hiring outside contractors. There's something else, Daniel continued, pulling out Ethan's mechanical drawings. My son designed this quality control system as a school project. It shows the kind of innovative thinking that emerges when people feel valued and empowered. Workers gathered around the drawings, their professional expertise recognizing sophisticated solutions to problems they faced daily. Carlos whistled appreciatively as he studied the sorting mechanism. This kid's got real talent. The pneumatic controls would save us hours of manual sorting. That's exactly my point, Daniel said. Innovation comes from understanding problems at the ground level, not from management consultants who've never operated the equipment. I want to create a formal suggestion program where good ideas are implemented and their creators are rewarded. Jenny Martinez, who'd been struggling with the cutting machine that was finally repaired, spoke up tentatively. Mr. Brooks, this all sounds wonderful, but what about the financial reality? Can the company afford these improvements? Daniel had prepared for this question, understanding that workers' skepticism was based on years of being told that their welfare conflicted with company success. Linda, could you share the actual financial projections? Linda stood, her confidence reflecting the detailed analysis she'd prepared over the past week. Under Gerald's management, we were losing money through inefficiency, quality problems, and customer dissatisfaction. The improvements Daniel's proposing will actually increase profitability by reducing turnover, improving quality, and strengthening customer relationships. She displayed charts showing how worker satisfaction correlated with productivity, how proper equipment maintenance reduced crisis repairs, how customer loyalty justified premium pricing that more than offset increased labor costs. The data supported what Uncle Robert had known intuitively. Treating workers well was good business, not charitable sentiment. Patricia Collins from the board attended as an observer, her presence lending credibility to the changes being announced. The board fully supports these initiatives, she confirmed. We've seen the evidence that companies with engaged workforces consistently outperform those focused solely on cost reduction. The meeting continued for 2 hours, as workers asked detailed questions about implementation timelines, eligibility requirements, and appeals processes. Daniel answered each inquiry with specificity that demonstrated serious commitment, rather than vague promises. As the formal meeting concluded, groups formed around specific topics: the apprenticeship program, the safety bonus structure, the suggestion system for operational improvements. The energy in the room felt different from anything Daniel had experienced during Gerald's tenure, workers talking excitedly about possibilities rather than complaining about problems. Ethan appeared in the doorway as workers were beginning to leave, his school backpack slung over one shoulder and a new mechanical drawing clutched in his free hand. Several workers noticed him and gathered around, curious about the young designer whose quality control system had impressed their new CEO. "What's this one?" Carlos asked, examining Ethan's latest creation. "An automated inventory tracking system," Ethan replied with the seriousness of someone discussing critical engineering problems. "I was thinking about how much time workers spend looking for parts and tools. This would use sensors to track everything automatically." Frank Sullivan studied the drawing with professional interest. "Kid's right about the time waste. We probably spend an hour each shift just hunting for the right wrenches. Could you make this work?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious about his son's engineering capabilities. "With some help from the electrical guys, sure," Frank replied. "The basic concept is solid. Just needs refinement for practical implementation." The impromptu discussion continued as workers collaborated with a 10-year-old on solving problems that had frustrated them for years. Daniel watched his son interact with experienced craftsmen who treated his ideas with respect rather than condescension, understanding that innovation could come from anyone willing to think creatively about familiar challenges. Gerald Kane appeared in the doorway as the crowd was thinning, his presence creating an uncomfortable silence. Workers who'd been enthusiastically discussing improvements suddenly remembered the man who'd made their working lives increasingly difficult over the past 2 years. "Impressive turnout," Gerald said, his tone carefully neutral, "though I hope the financial commitments being made are sustainable long-term." Daniel studied his former boss, noting the defeat in Gerald's posture, despite his attempt to maintain professional dignity. The acquisition rejection had been a devastating blow to someone who'd staked his reputation on efficiency-focused management principles. "Gerald, I meant what I said about the consulting position. Your analytical skills and industry knowledge are valuable, even if we approach leadership differently." The offer hung in the air like a bridge across philosophical differences that had defined their conflict. Gerald's response would determine whether he could adapt to serving the vision he'd opposed or would remain trapped in resentment over authority he'd lost. "I appreciate the opportunity," Gerald said finally, his voice reflecting genuine surprise at Daniel's continued generosity, "though I'm not sure how my management philosophy fits with your approach." "Maybe that's exactly why your perspective is valuable," Daniel replied. "We need someone who asks hard questions about sustainability and efficiency, even if we disagree about methods." As the meeting hall emptied, Daniel found himself alone with Ethan, Linda, and the scattered materials that represented a new chapter in Brooks Manufacturing's history. The changes announced today would take months to implement fully, requiring sustained effort and careful attention to both worker needs and financial realities. "Dad," Ethan said, gathering his drawings, "do you really think my designs could help the company?" Daniel knelt beside his son, seeing in the boy's eyes the same innovative spirit that had built the company Uncle Robert had entrusted to his care. "Buddy, I think your designs represent exactly the kind of thinking that will keep us competitive for the next 30 years. The rebuilding had begun, but Daniel understood that real transformation would require more than policy changes and profit-sharing formulas. It would require proving every day that business success and human dignity weren't just compatible, but mutually reinforcing in an economy that increasingly demanded choosing between them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he could rest knowing that the foundation for lasting change had been laid with input from the people who would determine its ultimate success. 6 months later, the Brooks Manufacturing annual gathering filled the factory floor with celebration rather than obligation. Workers brought their families to see where they spent their days, children running between the newly maintained machines while parents explained the craft that supported their households with dignity and pride. Daniel stood before the assembled crowd without notes or podium, his words carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd earned respect through consistent action. "Uncle Robert built this company on a simple principle, that business succeeds when people succeed. We lost sight of that for a while, but we found our way back." The Margaret Brooks Skills Development Center occupied the renovated East Wing, its classrooms filled with apprentices learning trades that would serve them for decades. Gerald Kane, surprising everyone including himself, had become the program's most dedicated instructor, his analytical mind perfectly suited to teaching quality control and efficiency, but efficiency that served workers rather than replacing them. This year's profit-sharing checks represent 23% above last year's total, Daniel announced to enthusiastic applause. But more importantly, we haven't lost a single major contract, and 3 new clients have specifically requested our services based on our reputation for reliability. Ethan moved through the crowd with his latest invention, a tablet-based system for tracking maintenance schedules that had eliminated the crisis repairs that once plagued production. At 11, he was already talking seriously about mechanical engineering, inspired by workers who treated his ideas as valuable contributions rather than childish fantasies. As the celebration continued around them, Daniel and Ethan found themselves in the quiet corner where Uncle Robert's portrait hung beside a new plaque, Margaret Brooks Memorial Workshop, where innovation serves community. "Mom would have liked this," Ethan said, studying the faces of families whose lives had been stabilized by decisions made in boardrooms but lived out on factory floors. Daniel placed his hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the weight of legacy and responsibility that connected past to future. "She would have been proud of what we've built together, all of us." The factory hummed with the sound of honest work and shared purpose, a testament to the quiet power of leadership that lifted others rather than seeking elevation. In choosing service over dominance, Daniel had discovered that true authority came not from position, but from the courage to make decisions that honored both profit and principle. The circle was complete, but the story continued in every worker who went home each night knowing their effort mattered, in every family whose future was secure, and in every young person who learned that business could be both successful and humane. Uncle Robert's faith had been justified, Margaret's values lived on, and Ethan's generation would inherit a world where doing the right thing still mattered, even when, especially when, it cost something precious in return. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.